These are the Necrons, a species that traded away everything that made them alive in exchange for a body that cannot die. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are armies of screaming zealots, armies of gene-modified super soldiers, armies of demons wearing the shape of nightmares. And then there is this, an army that does not scream, does not rage, does not fear, because there is almost nothing left inside it, capable of feeling any of those things. What makes the Necrons terrifying isn't that they want to destroy you. It's that destroying you costs them nothing, because they've already lost everything worth protecting. To understand why, you have to go back further than almost any other story in Warhammer 40,000, back before the Imperium, before the Emperor, before humanity had left its solar system. You have to go back to a dying world, a doomed species, and a bargain that seemed, for one desperate moment, like salvation. The Necrons were not always Necrons. Before the living metal, before the immortality, before the silence, they were the Necrontyr, an organic species born on a radiation-blighted homeworld, orbiting a dying star. Their planet was barren, hostile, and saturated with radiation, and every Necrontyr who was ever born inherited the consequences of that environment in their own body. Radiation sickness wasn't a disease that struck some of them. It was the baseline condition of being Necrontyr. They lived short lives, and they lived those lives in pain. This single biological fact shaped everything about Necrontyr civilization. A species that knows it is dying, and dying young, doesn't build the same kind of culture as a species with centuries to spare. The Necrontyr built an empire defined by urgency, by hierarchy, by the desperate accumulation of glory and power in whatever time each individual had left. At the head of that empire sat a ruling council called the Triarch, and the Triarch was led by a figure known as the Silent King, a title held, at the very end of the Necrontyr era, by a noble named Szarekh. The Silent King earned his title because he didn't address his people directly. He spoke through the other two Pharaons of the Triarch, a structure of formal, ritualized distance between ruler and ruled that tells you something about how Necrontyr society already worked, long before anything mechanical entered the picture. The Necrontyr weren't a peaceful people, and they weren't without ambition, but everything they built under a death sentence written into their own genetics. And then they encountered a civilization that had no such sentence at all. The Old Ones were, by any measure the Necrontyr could apply to themselves, gods, where the Necrontyr crawled between stars in slow ships, spending long stretches of every journey in stasis crypts just to survive the transit. The Old Ones moved across the galaxy instantly, using a network of dimensional pathways called the Webway. The Old Ones had mastered the warp. They had seeded life across the galaxy, shaping entire ecosystems and species according to their own designs. Next to them, the Necrontyr weren't rivals. They were an afterthought. This is the part of the story that matters most for understanding what came later. The Necrontyr went to war with the Old Ones, and they lost, decisively and repeatedly. There was no competition. The Necrontyr were driven from world after world, pushed to the fringes of the galaxy, and left there to survive on the margins of a war they couldn't win by any conventional means. This conflict, the oldest and most consequential war in the setting's history, became known as the War in Heaven, and for a long stretch of it, the Necrontyr weren't fighting for victory, they were fighting to avoid extinction. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because it's the emotional key to everything the Necrons became. This wasn't a proud species expanding its dominion. This was a defeated, dying, radiation-poisoned people, beaten again and again by beings who barely had to try, retreating into the dark edges of the galaxy to nurse a hatred they had no way to act on. Bitterness like that doesn't just disappear, it waits. And eventually, it found a way to become something else entirely. Somewhere in the depths of that exile, the Necrontyr encountered something that changed the calculus of the entire war, the C'tan. In their natural form, the C'tan aren't creatures in any conventional sense. They're vast beings of pure energy, spreading themselves across the surface of stars and feeding on the solar output. They're old enough that their true origins are barely understood, even within their own myth cycle. And to a desperate, dying species, looking for any leverage against an enemy they could never beat conventionally, the C'tan represented something close to salvation. The Necrontyr gave these star gods physical form, bodies of living metal called necrodermis, engineered to focus the C'tan's vast power, and, crucially, to give them true sentience and a means of directly interacting with material reality. In exchange, the C'tan would fight beside the Necrontyr against the Old Ones. Several of these C'tan would go on to define the mythology of the entire Necron faction. Azagorod, who became known to later species as the Nightbringer, carved an image into the collective unconscious of younger civilizations that would echo forward for tens of millions of years, an image close enough to universal death itself that cultures across the galaxy, who had never heard of the Necrontyr, would still develop myths of a grim reaper figure. Mephrit, the Deceiver, was defined from the outset by manipulation and plotting, rather than direct confrontation. Mugladroth, the Void Dragon, would come to be regarded as the single most powerful of all the C'tan. And Hlandugor, known as the Flayer, played a role in the war, whose consequences would haunt the Necrons for the rest of their existence, a consequence we'll come back to, because it's one of the most disturbing threads in the entire faction's lore. The alliance between the Necrontyr and the C'tan was, on paper, exactly what a losing side needs, a force multiplier powerful enough to reverse the outcome of an unwinnable war. But the price of that alliance hadn't been fully reckoned with yet. It was about to be. Here is where the story stops being military history and becomes something closer to body horror. The C'tan didn't just want alliance, they wanted worship, and they wanted power, and the clearest path to both ran directly through the frailty of the Necrontyr's organic bodies. Under Szarekh's order, a decision made in the full desperation of a losing war, by a leader watching his species die by inches, every Necrontyr was to submit to enormous constructs called bio-furnaces. Inside them, flesh was stripped away and replaced with a new form, immortal, mechanical, effectively indestructible. This process was called Bio-transference, and it's the single event that transformed the Necrontyr into the Necrons. On the surface, it worked. It solved, permanently, the exact problem that had defined Necrontyr existence since the beginning, the short, radiation-poisoned lifespan, the constant proximity to death. The new bodies didn't get sick. They didn't age. They didn't die from wounds that would have killed an organic soldier 100 times over. For a species that had spent its entire existence racing a fatal clock, biotransference stopped the clock entirely. But it didn't transfer a Necrontyr's mind, personality, and soul into that new body, cleanly or completely. The process stripped most of what made an individual Necrontyr who they were. The new Necrons that emerged from the bio-furnaces were stronger, yes, but devoid of free will, and instead bound to their masters and their hierarchy through rigid command protocols. Only the highest-ranking nobles had been given the kind of extensive circuitry needed to preserve their original personalities and independent thought. Everyone below that tier came out the other side as something closer to an obedient shell, wearing the shape of who they used to be. This is the detail that separates the Necrons from almost every other faction's tragedy in the setting. They didn't lose a war, they didn't lose their homeworld, or their culture, or their freedom to some external conqueror. They walked, by their own choice and under their own leader's direct order, into machines that stripped away their minds, and they did it because the alternative, slow radiation death, seemed worse at the time. Immortality, bought at the price of the self. Every rank-and-file Necron warrior you'll ever see in this setting is, in a very real sense, a ghost operating a body that used to belong to someone with hopes, memories, and fears, almost none of which survived the transition. And it gets worse, because the C'tan were watching the entire process, and they weren't merely observing. As the bio-furnaces did their work, the C'tan gathered around the biotransference sites and fed. Every Necrontyr who went through that process cast off a torrent of life energy in the transition from flesh to metal, and the C'tan drank it in, growing stronger with every single conversion. What had been framed as a partnership was, in practice, also a feeding ground. The C'tan, using the desperation of their supposed allies to fuel their own ascension to a level of power the Necrontyr had never fully appreciated when they made the bargain. By the time Szarekh, now inhabiting a mechanical body himself, fully grasped what had happened, the damage was done. He had traded his species' souls to win a war, and handed his supposed allies a banquet in the process. It's described plainly in the lore as a realization that came to him as a terrible mistake, not a victory with an asterisk, but a genuine catastrophe he had authored with his own decree. And yet, militarily, it worked. With their new necrodermis bodies, effectively immune to the kinds of harm that had crippled them for their entire history, and with the C'tan fighting alongside them at devastating scale, the Necrons finally had what they needed to match the old ones. The war that follows is described in the setting's lore in genuinely apocalyptic terms. Entire planets razed, stars extinguished outright, whole star systems devoured by artificial black holes, summoned into being through the C'tan's reality-warping power. This wasn't a war fought at the scale of armies clashing on a battlefield. It was a war fought at the scale of galactic infrastructure, solar systems as casualties, not just the beings living in them. The Old Ones, for everything they had, their mastery of the warp, their control of the webway, their long head start on nearly every other species in the galaxy, couldn't match the combined might of the Necrons and the Star Gods. Bit by bit, world by world, the war turned. The species that had been driven to the fringes of the galaxy and left to die became the force that broke the gods who had beaten them. It's tempting to read this as a triumphant turn in the story. It isn't. It's the exact moment the trap fully closes, because the Necrons who won that war weren't the same species that started it. What survived to see the Old Ones fall was an army of soulless immortal automatons and the Star Gods who had gorged themselves on their transformation. There was no version of victory available to the Necrontyr that let them keep both the war and themselves. They picked the war. Once the Old Ones were defeated, the alliance between the Necrons and the C'tan had no more shared enemy to hold it together, and Szarekh, embittered by what he now understood about the cost of biotransference and the C'tan's role in it, moved against his former allies. The rebellion that followed pitted the Necrons directly against the Star Gods, who had helped them win the single largest war in the galaxy's history. They won that fight too. The C'tan who survived the Necron rebellion were shattered, broken apart into fragments known as C'tan Shards, each one a portion of the original Star God's power and consciousness, far more manageable and far easier to contain than the whole. These shards were sealed away inside devices called Tesseract Labyrinths, extra-dimensional prisons built specifically to hold beings that powerful indefinitely. The gods who had fed on the Necrontyr's transformation were, in the end, dismembered and locked in boxes by the very species they had exploited. It's one of the strangest, darkest turns in the entire mythology of Warhammer 40,000, a war against literal star gods, won by a species that had already lost everything a war is supposed to be fought to protect. There was no homeland left to defend in any meaningful sense, no culture left uncorrupted by the bio-furnaces, no real self left in most of the soldiers doing the fighting. What was left was hierarchy, obedience, and the hollow shell of a victory nobody was left to properly feel. With the Old Ones defeated and the C'tan broken and imprisoned, Szarekh made a decision that would define the Necrons for the vast majority of their subsequent existence. He ordered the entire race into what's known as the Great Sleep, a mass hibernation inside stasis crypts, buried deep within enormous constructed structures called tomb worlds. The plan was almost geological in its patience. the Necrons would slumber for roughly 60 million years, allowing the galaxy to heal from the devastation of the war in heaven, allowing their living metal bodies time to repair themselves from the damage of the fighting, and, critically, allowing the younger, newer species rising across the galaxy to exhaust themselves fighting each other, so that when the Necrons finally woke, they could reclaim their dominion with minimal resistance. Think about the sheer scale of that decision. 60 million years isn't a strategy on a human timescale, or even a civilizational one. It's a plan, built by beings who no longer experience time the way anything organic does, who could afford to treat the rise and fall of entire other species as background noise, a rounding error in a much longer game. While the Necrons slept, worlds were born and died above their buried tombs. Empires that had no idea the Necrons even existed rose, expanded, and in some cases collapsed entirely, all while an older, more patient threat lay dormant in the ground beneath them, waiting out the clock. This is where much of the terror of the Necrons as a faction actually lives, and it's easy to miss if you only think of them as robots with guns. They aren't an invading force from outside your world. In the fiction of Warhammer 40,000, a Necron tomb world can be sitting directly underneath a human colony that has lived there for generations, utterly unaware that the ground itself is a grave that occasionally wakes up. When Necron worlds do wake, a process the lore refers to as the Great Awakening, what emerges isn't a single unified army, but a deeply fractured civilization. Necron society is organized into dynasties, each ruled by nobility, bearing titles like Pharaoh and Overlord, and while the Szarekhan dynasty, Szarekh's own lineage, claims supremacy over all the others by right of the Silent King's original authority, that claim is honored more in theory than in practice. Individual dynasties pursue their own agendas, their own rivalries, their own interpretations of what the Necrons should be doing with their reclaimed existence. The differences between dynasties aren't cosmetic. The Nihilakh are territorial expansionists, focused on methodically reclaiming and holding ground. The Novokh are defined by outright bloodlust, prioritizing combat and slaughter over the patient calculation more typical of other dynasties. The Mephrit specialize in devastating solar-powered weaponry, channeling the destructive power that echoes back to the C'tan's own stellar origins. Even two tomb worlds belonging to the same dynasty can wake into very different circumstances and behave in strikingly different ways, shaped by the specific conditions of their reawakening, how intact their forces are, what threats surround them, how much of their command structure survived 60 million years of stasis intact. Beneath the noble ranks sit the cryptechs, the scientist-sorcerers of Necron society, the ones responsible for maintaining the staggering array of technology that keeps a Necron dynasty functioning across geological timescales. It's the cryptechs who maintain and refine the systems that make Necron warriors so nightmarish to fight in the first place. Two pieces of Necron technology do more than anything else to explain why fighting them feels less like combat and more like fighting entropy itself. The first is the standard weapon of the rank-and-file Necron warrior, the Gauss weapon. What makes Gauss technology so unsettling isn't just raw damage output, it's the mechanism. Necron technology refers to a process called translation, and it's the same underlying principle used by Gauss weapons, breaking the bonds of matter in whatever they hit, converting the target into energy that the Necrons can, in principle, repurpose later. A Gauss weapon isn't just killing you, it's disassembling you at a fundamental level and treating the raw material of your body as a resource. There's a specific kind of horror in a weapon that doesn't just end a life, but erases the physical substance of what that life was standing in. The second is Reanimation Protocols. This is the mechanic and the lore concept that defines what it actually feels like to fight the Necrons on a battlefield. When a Necron warrior is cut down, its living metal body doesn't simply lie there as a corpse. The necrodermis knits itself back together, and the construct simply stands back up and resumes the advance, as if the wound had never happened. This isn't resurrection in any dramatic, narratively significant sense. No dying words, no final struggle. It's closer to watching a machine reboot. You didn't defeat that soldier, you inconvenienced it, briefly, and it's standing up again, because standing up again is simply what its body does. Multiply that across an entire army, and you get the specific, grinding despair that defines combat against the Necrons, the sense that nothing you do is actually final. Here's the part of Necron lore that pushes past mechanical horror into something closer to psychological horror, and it goes back to Landugor, the Flayer, the C'tan destroyed during the War in Heaven. In its dying moments, Landugor inflicted a curse on the Necrons, an echo of its own fathomless, consuming hunger, embedded somewhere in the species' collective psyche or technology. Necrons, afflicted by this curse, are known as Flayed Ones, and the affliction is described in the lore as a virus-like process that drives its victims into an insane hunger for blood and gore. Flayed Ones don't fight with the same detached, protocol-driven purpose as ordinary Necron warriors. They kill in order to feed a hunger, and, in one of the more disturbing details in the entire mythos, they wear the flayed skin and body parts of the enemies they kill. What makes this genuinely unsettling, rather than just grotesque, is what it implies about the rest of the faction. Remember, Bio-transference stripped away almost everything that made a Necrontyr an individual, leaving behind, in most cases, an obedient shell running on command protocols instead of free will and emotion. The Flayed Ones represent what happens when that suppression fails, when whatever fragment of the original organic self still exists somewhere inside that living metal body, breaks through the protocols that were built specifically to keep it contained. It suggests that inside the silent, obedient ranks of ordinary Necron warriors, something is still, in some diminished and half-erased way, present, buried, waiting, and when it does surface, it doesn't come back as a person, it comes back as pure, ravenous hunger, dressed in the skin of whoever it can catch. Some who worship Landugor as their patron form what's known as Flayer cults, and in one especially unnerving documented case, even Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests experimenting directly with living necrodermis became infected with the Flayer virus themselves, descending into self-mutilation and worship of the dead C'tan. The curse isn't confined neatly to Necron biology, it travels with the metal. The C'tan themselves remain one of the most disquieting elements of the entire faction, precisely because they were never fully destroyed, only shattered and imprisoned. Magladroth, the Void Dragon, regarded as the single most powerful of all the C'tan, remains in stasis to this day, contained rather than eliminated. Mephrit, the Deceiver, has emerged from stasis and has spent the intervening time weaving plots across the galaxy, true to the character his name implies, manipulation as a permanent modus operandi rather than a wartime tactic. And as a Gorod, the Nightbringer, has left an imprint on the collective psyche of younger species, so deep and so consistent that it has, in the lore's own framing, effectively become the template for death god mythology across multiple unrelated cultures who never had any direct contact with the Necrons at all. A being that terrifying doesn't need to conquer a species to haunt it. It just needs to be glimpsed once, by the right ancestor, at the right moment, and the fear does the rest of the work across generations. These are gods, broken into pieces and locked in extra-dimensional boxes by the very civilization they once fed on, and every one of those boxes is still out there, in Necron hands, being fought over, guarded, occasionally stolen, or shattered open by accident or design. The single most powerful beings in this era of the galaxy's history are, right now, sitting in storage. That's not a settled threat. That's a threat on layaway. The Great Sleep was always meant to end, and in the 41st millennium, it does. The Necrons began what the lore calls their Great Awakening and Szarekh himself returned to the galaxy after a long sojourn in the intergalactic void beyond the galaxy's edge, a period during which he discovered something that changed the urgency of his return entirely: the approach of the Tyranid hive fleets, an extragalactic threat operating on a scale and with an appetite that even the Necrons had reason to take seriously. Szarekh's return isn't a triumphant homecoming. It's the return of a leader who, by his own reckoning, made the single most catastrophic decision in his species' history, the decree that led to biotransference, the choice that stripped his people of their souls to win a war that, in hindsight, cost them everything the war was supposed to protect. He comes back to a galaxy his own species radically reshaped and then abandoned for 60 million years, to find some of his dynasties barely recognizable in their goals, some of his C'tan still imprisoned, and new threats circling that his ancient empire never had to account for. The current era of Necron lore is defined less by a unified invasion and more by internal fracture. The Silent King Szarekh and Imotekh the Stormlord, leader of the Szarekh dynasty and one of the most prominent Necron figures to emerge during the Great Awakening, represent two fundamentally different visions of what the Necrons should become now that they're back. That disagreement has escalated into open civil war, playing out most visibly in a conflict known as the Pariah Nexus, centered on the Nephilim sector. Into that already volatile Necron infighting comes the Indomitus Crusade, the Imperium's massive post-Cicatrix Maledictum military campaign, with Battlegroup Kalades sent to investigate the Nexus and instead finding itself dragged into a full-scale war zone. Part of what draws Imperial forces so deeply into the conflict is the presence of Noctilith, more commonly known as Blackstone, a substance connected to the closure of the Great Rift, and specifically sought after by the Archmagos Belisarius Call and the experimental tech priests under his command, who see in the Nephilim sector a chance to acquire enough of the material to meaningfully affect the wound torn across the galaxy by the Great Rift itself. And, as if a Necron civil war, intersecting with an Imperial crusade, weren't enough factions for one war zone, Chaos forces under Vashtorr have since entered the fight as well, turning the Pariah Nexus into one of the most layered, unstable conflict zones in the current era of the setting. It's a fitting place for the Necron story to currently sit, not a clean, external invasion with a clear beginning and end, but an ancient, unresolved argument between an immortal king and the general who built an empire in his absence, dragging every other faction unlucky enough to wander into the blast radius along with it. Step back from the individual details, the Gauss weapons, the Reanimation Protocols, the Flayed Ones, the imprisoned star gods, and look at the shape of the whole story. Nearly every other major faction in Warhammer 40,000 derives its horror from something recognizably alive: corruption, ambition, hunger, faith twisted into fanaticism, hatred given form. The Necrons derive their horror from the opposite direction. Almost nothing is left inside most of them at all. They're a species that looked at the certainty of their own death and chose, deliberately and with full knowledge of what it would cost, to trade away free will, personality, emotion, and in most cases, the entire continuity of the self, in exchange for a body that simply doesn't stop. They won a war against literal gods using that traded-away selfhood as fuel, then turned around and imprisoned those same gods rather than share power with them. They put themselves to sleep for 60 million years as a strategic maneuver, treating the rise and fall of entire other civilizations as an acceptable rounding error in their timeline. And what woke up afterward is an army that doesn't hate you, doesn't fear you, and in most cases isn't capable of feeling much of anything about you at all. It simply keeps advancing and keeps reassembling itself every time you manage to knock it down, because reassembling itself isn't a choice it's making. It's just what the metal does now. Somewhere in the ranks of every Necron force, that suppression occasionally fails, and what crawls back out isn't a person reclaiming themselves. It's the Flayer Curse, an inherited hunger with no more self behind it than the obedient soldiers it used to be. And behind all of it, still locked in extra-dimensional boxes, carried by the very civilization that once fed them, sit the shattered remnants of beings powerful enough to burn out stars, gods that a species without souls of its own once had the audacity to defeat. That's why the Necrons are, quite literally, one of the most terrifying factions in the galaxy. Not because they want to hurt you, because there's almost nothing left inside them to want anything at all, and the almost is the most frightening word in the entire faction's history.